Good morning. Welcome to Sally Talk. It is Friday morning. And today I wanted to talk about ghosting. So how I came to this was because I have been doing, I decided that I wanted to use this podcast to raise awareness to my journey with dealing with the grief from suicide loss, but also to kind of eliminate the stigma in my own small way. Because if you listen to last week's 5 ways to help a suicide survivor, that was basically, if you listen to it, hopefully it was to say that, you know, there are, I was like, oh, well, that sounds kind of like how you would help anybody who was going through grief. And that's exactly what I was hoping you would get. My sister's husband passed away yesterday afternoon after a long battle with Alzheimer's, and then he passed away from complications due to Alzheimer's. And it's just been a long, long journey. And so supporting her through the grief process is going to be very similar. Although I think with suicide or with any tragic death, there are other areas that make it a little more complicated and a little more difficult. But, grief is grief. In the past, in history, of course, religious, have found that suicide was illegal or immoral, or that you burned in hell if you committed suicide. If you in some insurance policies, it's null and void if you commit suicide. So the survivors won't even receive any of the benefit to help them through the whole journey. So it's interesting because it's really a conundrum. You don't want to make it acceptable in the sense that you don't want to make it so that it's a normal part of life, that, oh yeah, people commit suicide, like it's okay, because it isn't okay. And we do want to find ways that we can reach out and help people who get, and that's their last hope or their last solution. And you want to help them and get them to not do that. But on the other hand, once it's happened, the survivors really need that support. And with doing these podcasts, someone reached out to me through social media who is a suicide loss survivor. And, she explained to me that I've been getting a lot of responses, which is what I wanted. So, which is good. I think we all need to talk out more, and the more responses I get from a lot of other people like me is that we need to talk more. If we want to really erase the stigma, we need to talk more. And she was saying that she had no support afterwards because of what it was. And she was completely abandoned. And it just broke my heart because I really don't have any idea what that would be like, to just be completely abandoned. Now, I have a very deep faith, and so because of that faith, I have never in my life have ever felt truly alone, because I really do always feel God with me, and I do talk with him. I remember one time I heard a story where they said, you bring God to the table, like people, if you have a faith in God, you bring him to the dinner table, and you only ask him to pass food, but you never talk to him. Don't be like that. And I thought that was kind of interesting. It was like the only time you talk to God is when you want something. But if you kind of have I have kind of an internal monologue all the time, internal dialogue with him all the time about what I want and what's happened and thanks for that or whatever, or gosh, how am I going to get out of that? Kind of like you would a friend on a hike, talking about stuff. I kind of have that kind of dialogue going on in my head. You might think I'm crazy, but it really doesn't I really don't feel alone. And so I think even if I had been completely abandoned, I think when it really got dark, I think I still would feel like he was with me which is a blessing. But it really broke my heart, though, that anybody would feel like there was nobody there to support them. And there's a lot of stigma out there, and it really does scare people to have to, I don't know, to be part of it. And it scares them and it shakes them up. And so they don't want to be around the person, I guess, who is the definition of that. And so it made me think about my own journey. And the truth is that I had, I was abandoned. Like, there were people that cut me out, and I am no longer really friends with them anymore. And I don't know if that was the reason, or I'm not sure what it was, but all I know is we're not in communication anymore. And it reminded me of ghosting. So I mentioned to my new friend that, I said, oh, well, it sounds like ghosting. Maybe I should do an episode of my podcast on ghosting. And she was like, I don't even really know what that is. And so I said, oh, and I told her, and she said, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. I feel like I was ghosted. So over this week, I've kind of mentioned it to other people about doing a podcast on ghosting, and quite a few people did not know what it meant. So I thought, well, then now I really need to do it on ghosting, because if any of you out there are listening and you don't know what ghosting is, I feel most of the time I feel like I'm behind the times. Like, I don't recognize any actors anymore. There are people that are winning like Lifetime Achievement Awards, and I'm starting to not know who they are, or I haven't seen that many of their movies. So I'm starting to feel kind of like, out of the loop at 56. But when I realized that I kind of knew a term that was a current term and some of my friends didn't know what it is, it made me feel like I was back in the loop. But anyway, so I'm going to read the Wikipedia definition of ghosting, just the first part of it. But so ghosting is a breaking off of a relationship, often an intimate relationship, by ceasing all communication and contact with the former partner without any apparent warning or justification, as well as ignoring the former partner's attempts to reach out or communicate. The term originated in 2011. In that decade, social media reported a rise in ghosting, which has been attributed to increasing use of social media and online dating apps. So it originally started in being used for personal relationships. So somebody would get on a dating site or whatever, and you'd go back and forth and email or whatever, and then meet, and then okay, I'll we'll text, or we'll get together again, or whatever, and they go on a date, and then they never hear from the person again, and then they send them a text and say, oh, well, hey, haven't heard from you, hope all's well, and they literally never hear from them again. So it started out as that. It was from like a dating thing. And when I was young, I remember that, and I'm guilty of it too. There's a whole nother level of it where they've talked about ghosting, where it used to be kind of a woman's safety thing, where because when women went out, we would be worried that, we would be preyed on, Ted Bundy and all that stuff. You weren't sure if you gave your phone number out, if he's a stranger, you don't know anything about him. So, I remember my friends and I say we give them a phone number with one wrong digit, or, or you say you're going to be somewhere and you're not, or it's just your way of saying no because you just, for a man that wouldn't take no for an answer kind of thing. And so I remember times like that, and I kind of regret it, but you're young and you don't know, and so I guess that was like our form of ghosting when we were younger. And then you just don't return phone calls or whatever. But, and that's, in my situation, it was always like first, met him somewhere or met him at a party and then changed my mind and didn't want to date him or whatever. So you don't return the phone call. But what it's morphed into with ghosting is that now it's kind of morphed in with social media. It's morphed into kind of a way for people to, they think it's kind of a form of abuse. And I know my youngest son has told me that with all of the anti-bullying programs that they have now at school, because they really want to end bullying. And I have my own personal opinion about that, because, and especially working for the Boys and Girls Club, it has reinforced my opinion, is that we are never, I don't think, ever going to eliminate bullying. I think it's a great dream, but I don't think we're ever going to eliminate bullying. And I think raising children to think that they're going to be able to eliminate bullying, or that bullying is, they're going to go into an area where they're never going to be bullied, is doing a disservice to a child. You know, it's raising them in a bubble. And then when somebody bursts that bubble, they're devastated. I definitely feel like our job with children is to make them strong and make them be able to recognize when they're being mistreated, and to understand that either that person isn't their friend, or to, understand not to take it personally, but give them the strength to kind of judge it and to deal with it. Or as they say, teach them that snakes are going to come into the garden, and then teach them how to hack up the snakes, instead of teaching them that the snakes are never going to come into the garden, or the snakes shouldn't come into the garden. I think it's going to happen. So whether it's middle school, high school, college, the first job, at some point I think they're going to be bullied. And so I think they need to know how to recognize and stand up to it. That's just my opinion. But what my son was telling me about ghosting was, or he didn't really use ghosting, but he said that what they do, but it sounds like ghosting. He says what they do is they just ignore you. So that's how they, that's how they deal with it, is that so they know they can't say nasty things and say mean things, and they know they can't hit. So what they do is they just literally ignore you or ghost you, pretend that you don't exist. And that in itself is very, very hurtful. And so, and it's painful, because you feel like you don't even exist. You're not even there. They don't see you. And I was thinking about that is that's ghosting. And that's definitely a form of abuse. And I was thinking about John and his life, and certain stories that he had told me. And there were definitely times in his life where he was ghosted. And I'm not going to get into like all the details, but he was definitely ghosted. He was ghosted even as recent as when we first started going out. There was a thing that happened where, several friends of his just stopped having anything to do with him. And it's interesting because there are like things happen, and I think people think, oh, well, that's how I'll handle it, because if I don't want a confrontation, because people don't like confrontation, and they're pulling farther and farther away from confrontation. They confront each other on Twitter, and they confront each other on Facebook. It's easier to do it behind a computer screen. We all know that. Oh, the road rage in the car, But heaven forbid we do a face-to-face discussion and talk things through. So the easiest way to do it is just to not respond, the less confrontational, and not respond. But when I think about that throughout, when John and I would have these conversations, and there were people that just were out of his life. They were just, and then just before he died, it got hard. It was hard to be around him. And I mentioned that in a previous episode, that it was hard to be around him because he was talking a lot about, the coffee shop and all the stresses and all the pressures and everything else. And, one of his friends confided in me and said, it was hard to I had my own struggles, and I really was trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And the last thing I needed to hear was him complaining about how it was so hard to invest all his money in a coffee shop. It was hard for me to hear that. So it was hard to be around him. So, the thing to do is to go set your boundaries and go, okay, I really can't be around this. This is too much for me. So I think that that's kind of like how this all gets started. And with social media, you can, Saturday morning, you can get up and you can click on Facebook and you can go around, and I'm guilty of it too, go around and click, and like this and like that and send a heart and, thinking of you and all that other stuff. But I think we have to start, this is my opinion, but I think we have to start recognizing that if that's all we're doing, if we're just clicking and doing a heart and all that other stuff, and that's kind of like all we're doing for our close friends and loved ones. I love Facebook because you can keep in contact with acquaintances and people at a distance, or people who you knew a long time ago or whatever. And that is your relationship, is seeing each other on Facebook, clicking on things. That's fine. But if you're close friends and your family members and you're liking their stuff on Facebook, I don't think that's ghosting in a way, because you're doing really the minimal of really keeping in contact. And so when you're in grief, you are in this flood of grief and you're overwhelmed, and you receive a lot of attention right out of the gate. You're overwhelmed by how many people reach out and how many people are at the memorial service and how many people bring food and all of that stuff, and you're overwhelmed and you just think, oh my gosh, this is wonderful, it's great, all these people. I was lucky to have that. I can't imagine not having that, but I was lucky enough to have that. But then as time passed, then I was ghosted. There were people that do not speak to me anymore. They don't reach out to me. They don't contact me. And there's several people that were friends of mine that I would have, conversations with, or I keep in contact with, and that have not kept up that relationship. And so what happens is that you just kind of come out from underwater, and then you realize, as you're scrolling through Facebook or whatever, you realize you're like, wow, that person, I never hear from that person again. That person has never checked in to see how I was doing. And a grieving person isn't going to reach out. It's just too hard for them to reach out and ask you how you're doing. They're look at them as if they're, they're bedridden or they have a concussion. Like if somebody was in a car accident and had a concussion, you wouldn't expect them to contact you, and they were recovering from that concussion. You don't expect them to reach out and ask you how the new job's going. They just can't, So someone in grief is like that. I can say also somebody who is spiraling down in depression is like that. They just can't. It's not physically possible. But it doesn't look like it because they look fine. Sometimes I think that maybe we should go back to wearing all black, because when they wore all black, at least people went, oh, that person's grieving. I think it was a way, I researched it, it was a way for the community to go easy on that person, If that person all of a sudden leaves, walks out, bursts into tears, loses their temper, gets overwhelmed, faints, the reason was because they were in the grieving process. And so that's why they wore black, to tell everybody. And I think that might be a good idea to go back to, or some sort of form of understanded social, I don't know, a button or a hat or something, so that people understand that you're not yourself. And so you're not going to reach out and ask how the new job's going, So I just wanted to do this podcast to kind of like make sure, I don't know, just voice out my opinions about this, about ghosting, because I think it's an easy way to cut yourself out of somebody's life and think that person doesn't notice, but they do. They do. So don't think that, that cutting, so I don't think people should think that if they cut themselves out of somebody's life, that person doesn't notice, and then it's hurtful. And the thing with ghosting is that nobody knows why. So then you're left to your own mind to go around and think about, oh, well, it could have been this and it could have been that. And of course, you're in a compromised position when you're grieving, and especially of a suicide, because you're already thinking it was your fault that the person took their life. Now, to have somebody ghost you during the grieving process is that you're thinking you've done something wrong again, and now that person doesn't care. So I think it's really important to have a conversation, and I think it's really important to really make sure that the people you care about get face-to-face time or voice time. I think calling, good old-fashioned calling, and good old-fashioned coffees and lunches, I think are in order. To make sure that people know that the grieving person knows that you're there and you want to hear and you want to listen and you want to be there for them. Because sending things through and just liking their posts, it does not make for a real, authentic, true, rich, meaningful relationship, supportive relationship. And that's definitely not going to show the grieving person that you're there for them. So that's my episode. I'm very excited because starting next week on April 5th, I will have my first guest. And so my first guest is going to be my dear friend, Liz Barlack of Liz Barlack Photography. Now, she has built her own photography business, and she is very, very strong about empowering women and making them feel and kind of get back the magic that we all had when we were young, or get the magic for the first time. Maybe you didn't have it when you were young. But she and I have long conversations about that, and the little voices that haunt you and everything else. So that's what our topic is going to be, is that little voice that in your head that basically keeps telling you, can you really do this? And kind of tears you down, and how to kind of overcome that, and how she built her photography business. It's really an amazing story, and she's really a very inspiring person. So I'm so excited. So the episode will be longer next week, and it'll be live, and so it'll be Friday at 10 o'clock. So I really hope you join me. Thanks so much for tuning in. I appreciate all the feedback and the comments. I think I said I'm well over 200 plays of my episodes, and I'm so happy about that. And I'm going to keep going. I've got to, if you haven't followed me, please follow me here on Spreaker, because then I can launch onto iHeartRadio. So you click on follow, and I promise it doesn't cost anything. And then follow me on Facebook, follow me on Instagram. The more followers I have and everything, the more, obviously, I can move on and spread the word. All right? And then feedback is always welcome. I love feedback because I want to make sure I do the best job. And I keep learning. It's really interesting. This world is really interesting. All right. Have a great week. And I will talk to you again soon.
You're up in the sky, I'll carry you home to the mountaineers. And soon, my friend, you'll see them again, the ones you left behind, the ones you left behind. And I'll sing for you all the way home. as I walk